Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. Amos Dexter never wanted a war. He just wanted to run his 300-acre ranch in peace, like his family had for generations. But when a group of suburban elites moved in next door and decided they could control his land, they made a fatal mistake because Amos wasn't about to roll over. They wanted to fight. They got one. Amos Dexter had always known the land was more than just dirt and grass. It was history. His 300-acre ranch in Oklahoma had been in his family for generations, passed down like a sacred heirloom. His grandfather had bought it for next to nothing during the Great Depression, turning it into a thriving cattle ranch. His father had expanded it, and now Amos, at 50, ran the place with the same no-nonsense attitude that had kept it afloat for decades. The ranch was his life, his legacy, and as far as he was concerned, nothing and no one would ever change that. At least, that's what he thought before the suburb people moved in. About 2 years ago, developers bought the land adjacent to his property and turned it into Ridgewood Valley, an upscale housing community filled with people who wanted the country lifestyle without the reality of actual rural living. These weren't farmers or ranchers. They were wealthy suburbanites who thought driving an SUV and having a backyard garden made them rustic. They wanted the picturesque scenery, but none of the dust, none of the animals, and certainly none of the smell that came with real farm life. With them came something even worse, a homeowners association, HOA. At first, Amos didn't pay them much attention. He had nothing to do with their little community, and his land was not part of their HOA agreements. As far as he was concerned, they could play pretend all they wanted. He kept his cattle grazing, his tractors running, and his land exactly as it had been for generations. Then the letters started arriving. The first one came neatly printed on embossed paper, complete with the HOA's official seal. It politely requested that he consider limiting the number of cows he let graze near the property line because, according to complaints, the odor was disturbing the community. Amos laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. The second letter wasn't so polite. It demanded that he replace his wooden ranch fencing with something more in line with Ridgewood Valley's aesthetics. Another complaint mentioned that the roosters crowed too early in the morning, disturbing the peaceful ambiance. The third letter went even further. It claimed his tractor use was disruptive and that he needed to limit heavy machinery operations to approved hours. That's when Amos started getting really pissed off. One afternoon, as he was fixing a fence along the property line, a sleek black SUV rolled up his gravel driveway. Out stepped a tall woman in her mid-50s, dressed in a designer pantsuit and pristine white heels, a sight that looked completely out of place on a ranch. She strode toward him like she owned the place, flashing a tight, artificial smile. "Mr. Dexter, I presume?" "That's me," Amos grunted, leaning against the fence post. She extended a hand. Sheila Farrell, president of the Ridgewood Valley Homeowners Association. Amos didn't shake it. He just nodded, waiting. Sheila cleared her throat, withdrawing her hand. "I wanted to come speak with you personally. We've sent multiple notices, and I assume you've received them." "Oh, I got 'em," Amos said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "They went straight into my fireplace." She blinked, clearly thrown off for a moment before composing herself. "I see. Well, Mr. Dexter, we were hoping to reach a compromise. Your property is quite rustic. It's a ranch. Yes, but you see, it's affecting our community's property values." There it was, the real reason she was here. The HOA didn't care about the cows or the roosters. They cared about money. "You moved next to a working cattle ranch, and now you don't like the smell," Amos said, crossing his arms. "That's like buying a house next to a train track and complaining about the noise." Sheila forced a laugh. "I understand your perspective, but we have certain standards in Ridgewood Valley, and your property is, well, it's visible from the community." Amos let that hang in the air for a moment before asking, "So what exactly are you asking me to do?" She brightened. "I'm so glad you asked. We have a few simple requests. First, we'd like you to move your livestock at least half a mile from the property line. Second, we need you to replace that old wooden fence with something more modern. Wrought iron would be nice. Third, we'd appreciate it if you could limit your tractor use to after 10 a.m. so that—" Amos cut her off. "Not happening." She blinked again. "Excuse me. This land's been a working ranch since 1925. I'm not changing a damn thing because some city folks don't like the way it smells." Sheila's smile vanished. Her expression hardened into something colder. I was hoping we could resolve this amicably, but if you refuse to cooperate, the HOA will have no choice but to take further action. Amos chuckled, shaking his head. Lady, your HOA means jack squat to me. My land ain't part of your little suburb, and you got no authority here. Her lips pressed into a thin line. We'll see about that. She turned sharply on her heel and marched back to her SUV, slamming the door behind her before peeling out of the driveway. Amos watched the dust settle, muttering, "Hell's coming, I guess." And sure enough, it did. It didn't take long for Sheila Farrell and her HOA goons to make good on their threats. Just 3 days after their little conversation, Amos was out feeding his cattle when a county police cruiser pulled up to his barn. 2 uniformed officers stepped out, one older and one young enough to look fresh out of the academy. The senior officer, a burly man with a weathered face, approached. "Sir, we received a complaint about unauthorized commercial activity on this property." Amos wiped his hands on his jeans, unfazed. "That's so." "And who filed the complaint?" The officer glanced at his notepad. "A Miss Sheila Farrell." Amos let out a short, humorless laugh. "Figures." The younger officer chimed in. "Are you running any unlicensed businesses out here?" Amos gestured at the cows. "This is a ranch, son. I sell beef, eggs, hay, same as my family's done for generations. Got all my permits, if you need to see 'em." The older officer sighed. "Yeah, that'd be good." Amos led them inside, where he pulled out a thick binder filled with official state and federal agricultural licenses. The senior officer flipped through them, nodding. "Well, everything looks in order." He turned to his partner. "Guess we got ourselves another false report." The young officer frowned. "That's the 3rd one this week from that HOA." The senior cop rubbed his temple. "Yeah, and every time it's a damn waste of resources." Before leaving, the officer gave Amos a knowing look. "I don't think this is the last time she'll pull something like this. Keep your paperwork handy." Amos smirked. "Oh, I will." A week later, a county zoning official showed up, clipboard in hand, claiming they had received multiple reports of unsafe structures on the property. Amos walked him through the barn, the stables, the equipment sheds. Every single structure was up to code. The official seemed annoyed. "Look, I have to follow up on every complaint. I don't suppose you know who's filing them." Amos folded his arms. "Take a wild guess." The official sighed. "Damn HOAs. They think they run the whole county." After another fruitless inspection, the official left. Amos watched him go, shaking his head. The HOA was trying to drown him in bureaucracy, but they weren't done yet. 2 days later, Amos woke up to a loud banging on his front door. He opened it to find a state agricultural inspector standing there with a stern expression. "Morning," the man said. "We received reports that your livestock are being mistreated." Amos gritted his teeth. "Let me guess, Sheila Farrell?" The inspector didn't confirm or deny it, but the look in his eyes said enough. "Let's go see the animals," Amos muttered, leading the way. He walked the inspector through every inch of the ranch, showing him the healthy cattle, the clean feeding troughs, the properly stored hay, and the well-maintained pens. By the end of the tour, the inspector looked exasperated. "This is one of the best-kept ranches I've seen. I don't know what game these people are playing, but this was a complete waste of my time." Amos watched as the inspector drove off, his fists clenching. Sheila wasn't just trying to annoy him anymore, she was actively trying to destroy his way of life. And Amos wasn't going to take it lying down. Amos knew that Sheila Farrell and her HOA weren't going to stop their little war anytime soon, but he hadn't expected them to ramp things up so quickly. Less than a week after the false reports to the authorities failed, Amos was heading out to check on his fences when he noticed something strange. There were 2 men in HOA polo shirts standing by his barn, slapping bright orange violation stickers onto his tractor and equipment. Amos saw red. He stormed over, his boots kicking up dust. "Just what in the hell do you think you're doing?" One of the men, a thin, nervous-looking guy, took a step back. The other, a smug-looking HOA board member Amos recognized as Greg Whitman, crossed his arms. "This is official HOA business," Greg said. "Your machinery is a visual nuisance and must be moved out of sight immediately." Amos took a slow breath, trying not to explode right then and there. "You're on my land, Greg." His voice was dangerously low. "Which means you're trespassing." Greg scoffed. Ridgewood Valley has the right to enforce its standards on properties that are adjacent to the community. Amos laughed in his face. That's not how property law works, moron. Greg held up a printed copy of HOA bylaws, like it was some kind of holy document. Our legal team says otherwise. Amos pulled out his phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Sheriff, got some trespassers on my ranch, Amos said, staring Greg down. They seem to think they own my property. Greg's smug look finally faded. By the time the sheriff's deputies rolled up, Amos had a security camera recording of the whole thing. The officers took one look at the footage, then at the HOA clowns, and sighed. This again? One of them muttered. The deputies weren't amused. Greg and his buddy were fined for trespassing and forced to leave immediately. But Amos knew this wasn't over. Homeowners associations didn't like losing. The very next day, Sheila made her next move. Amos was working in the stables when he heard the sound of a chainsaw. He rushed outside and nearly had a stroke. A group of HOA hired workers was actively cutting down the old oak trees near his fence line, trees that had been standing for generations. "Hey, stop right now!" Amos roared, charging toward them. One of the workers, clearly just following orders, turned to him. "We were told this land is under HOA jurisdiction. Mrs. Farrell said these trees were unsightly and needed to be removed." Unsightly? Amos clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't care who Sheila thought she was. This had gone too far. He took photos of the damage, recorded the workers admitting Sheila had ordered it, and drove straight to his lawyer's office. It was time to take the HOA to court. Filing the lawsuit against the HOA had given Amos a moment of satisfaction, but he knew it wouldn't be the end of their nonsense. Sheila Farrell wasn't the type to back down after getting a slap on the wrist. She was the kind of person who doubled down. But even Amos hadn't expected what happened next. For the first time in months, things had been quiet. No fake reports, no inspectors, no trespassing HOA members trying to slap violations on his equipment. Sheila and her board had gone completely silent after his lawsuit was filed. At first, Amos thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally learned their lesson. Then he discovered the fence. It was early in the morning when Amos took his truck out to the northwestern edge of his ranch. A part of his land he didn't visit often since it was mostly open pasture. As he approached, something in the distance caught his eye. There was a fence where there hadn't been one before. Not just a fence, a full metal enclosure cutting off about 2 acres of his land. And in the middle of it stood a brand new sign, large and impossible to miss. Property of Ridgewood Valley, HOA. No trespassing. Amos's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. He put the truck in park, climbed out, and marched straight up to the unauthorized barrier. The posts were freshly drilled into the earth, the metal still gleaming in the morning sun. And inside the fenced-off land, he saw something that made his blood boil. Construction workers setting up what looked like the foundation of a structure. One of the workers spotted him and waved like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Morning. You here for the project?" Amos narrowed his eyes. "What project?" The man, some local contractor, wiped his hands on his jeans. "Summer house and pool for Sheila Farrell. HOA said they annexed this land from an unclaimed section of the valley." Amos took a slow, deep breath. Annexed. Unclaimed. This was his land, and Sheila Farrell had the guts to try and steal it right under his nose. Without another word, Amos turned on his heel, stomped back to his truck, and floored it all the way back to town. By the time he reached his lawyer's office, he was still so angry his hands were shaking. Jim Calloway, his attorney, looked up from his desk with raised brows. "I take it something happened." "You could say that," Amos growled, slamming his phone on the desk and pulling up pictures of the fence, the sign, and the construction site. Jim leaned forward, eyes scanning the images. Slowly, his expression shifted from confusion to outrage. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "They actually put up a fence and started building." "Yeah," Amos's voice was like gravel. "And they're calling it unclaimed land." Jim exhaled sharply, then reached for his files on the property. He flipped through land deeds, survey maps, and legal documents before slamming a finger down on one particular page. "This is your property," Jim confirmed. "There's no loophole, no unclaimed land nonsense. They just straight up stole it." Amos cracked his knuckles. "So what do we do?" Jim's grin was wolfish. "Oh, we're going to burn them to the ground." The very next morning, Amos and Jim marched straight into the county courthouse and filed an emergency injunction against the HOA. Illegal land seizure, fraud, destruction of private property, and the best part, they requested an immediate cease and desist order, which meant Sheila and her cronies had no idea what was coming. By noon, Amos had a court order in hand. By 2 p.m., he was back at the stolen land, and this time, he wasn't alone. 2 sheriff's deputies stood beside him as HOA contractors were forced to halt construction. And just as Amos expected, a very pissed-off Sheila Farrell came storming up the dirt road, looking like a cat that had just been tossed into a bathtub. "What the hell is going on here?" she snapped. One of the deputies held up the court order. "Ma'am, you and the Ridgewood Valley HOA have been served with an injunction. You are illegally occupying private property. All construction must stop immediately." Sheila's face twisted into something ugly. That land was unclaimed. Jim Calloway stepped forward with an actual land deed in hand, waving it in her face. "No, Sheila, it wasn't. This is Amos Dexter's land, and you knew it." Her expression flickered with panic for the briefest second before she straightened her shoulders. "This is a mistake. I have lawyers." Jim cut her off. "Yeah? So do we." And with that, Sheila Farrell, the all-powerful HOA queen, watched in horror as her dream summer home and pool came to an abrupt, humiliating end. Sheila Farrell wasn't used to losing, but as she stood there, clutching her pearls like she was about to faint, watching her dream summer home being shut down, Amos could see it finally sinking in. She had messed with the wrong man. The sheriff's deputies didn't even give her a chance to argue. The court order was final, and that meant all construction had to cease immediately. The workers were ordered off the property, and Sheila, well, she stood there fuming, her face red as a sunset. "This isn't over," she spat at Amos. "Oh, it's over," he said, arms crossed. "But while you're here, I got something for you." He turned to one of the deputies and motioned toward the massive, newly installed no trespassing sign he had brought earlier. It was even bigger than the one Sheila had put up, and it read, "Private property. Dexter Ranch. Trespassers will be prosecuted." And right below it, in bold letters, "Violators will be met with legal action and large angry cattle." Sheila's eyes bulged. "You can't be serious." Amos smirked. "Dead serious. In fact, consider this your final warning." Then, just to drive the point home, Amos personally nailed the sign to one of the metal fence posts before turning to the construction workers. "Y'all got 10 minutes to clear out," he said. "And if any of you step foot on my land again, you'll be getting a visit from my lawyer and a very large, very angry bull named Samson." The workers didn't hesitate. They grabbed their tools and left in a hurry. Sheila, however, lingered, her nails digging into her palms as she glared at Amos. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. Amos grinned. "Oh, I doubt that, Sheila, but I think you sure as hell will." And with that, Sheila stormed off, defeated. For now. Sheila Farrell might have lost the battle, but Amos knew she wasn't the type to go down without a fight. And, sure enough, just 3 days after her failed land grab, he got a letter from her attorneys, a desperate attempt to justify the HOA's actions. Ridgewood Valley HOA maintains the right to oversee properties that directly impact the community's aesthetic and overall value. Your aggressive actions against our board members and the unjust removal of HOA-approved fencing constitute a violation of community guidelines. We demand an immediate cease of all further retaliatory actions. Amos nearly choked on his coffee laughing. They were still trying to act like they had power over his land. This time, he didn't even bother responding. He let his lawyer, Jim Calloway, handle it. And Jim loved a good fight. The court hearing came fast and hard. Amos sat calmly at the plaintiff's table while Sheila and her overpriced legal team tried every trick in the book to claim that the land was mistakenly annexed, and that the HOA had every reason to believe it was unclaimed. But Jim wasn't having any of it. He laid out the evidence, survey maps, land deeds, the HOA's own emails proving they knew damn well the land wasn't theirs. He even had construction receipts showing that Sheila had personally approved the project for her own private use. The judge, a gruff older man who clearly had zero patience for HOA nonsense, leaned forward and gave Sheila a hard look. "Mrs. Farrell," he said, "what you and your HOA attempted was blatant land theft. You knowingly trespassed, authorized construction on land you didn't own, and repeatedly harassed Mr. Dexter despite having no legal authority over his property. Sheila swallowed hard, her perfect composure cracking for the first time. The ruling came down swiftly and brutally. The HOA was fined $300,000 for illegal land seizure, fraud, and trespassing. Sheila Farrell was forced to resign from her position as HOA president. All legal rights of the HOA to interfere with Amos's ranch were permanently revoked. Any future harassment from the HOA would result in criminal charges. And the cherry on top? The judge forced Sheila to personally sign a public apology to Amos, admitting that she had overstepped her authority and unlawfully tried to claim his land. By the time Sheila staggered out of the courtroom, she looked defeated, and Amos made sure she knew exactly how he felt about it. He tipped his hat and said with a smirk, "Guess Ridgewood Valley's property values just took a real hit, huh?" Sheila didn't answer. She just turned and walked away, her kingdom of control crumbling behind her. With Sheila Farrell gone, Ridgewood Valley's HOA had no teeth left to bite. Amos had won, and not just for himself. He had set a legal precedent that protected his ranch and ensured that no HOA in the county would ever pull this kind of stunt again. But the victory came with some unexpected consequences. In the weeks following the trial, something strange started happening. Residents of Ridgewood Valley, the same people who had once complained about his ranch, started showing up at his property, not to argue, not to throw more legal nonsense his way, but to buy fresh eggs, beef, and produce from the very farm Sheila had tried so hard to erase. One evening, as Amos was fixing a fence post near the old boundary line, a man in a crisp polo shirt and khakis hesitantly approached. Mr. Dexter?" Amos wiped sweat from his brow. "Yeah?" The man cleared his throat. "I just wanted to say, a lot of us didn't know what Sheila was really up to. We thought she was handling things for the good of the community, but," he sighed, "turns out we were just as sick of her as you were." Amos raised a brow. "That so?" The man nodded. We've been talking, and we actually think it'd be nice to have a real farmer's market, something to bring the community together. And, well, we figured there's no better person to run it than you." Amos couldn't help but laugh. "Oh, so now you want the smell of cow manure in your lives?" The man chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "I think we've learned a thing or two about appreciating the land." 1 year later, Amos stood on his newly built farm store porch, watching as families from Ridgewood Valley shopped for fresh produce. Kids fed the goats in the petting area, and former HOA members actually volunteered during the busy seasons. Ironically, the very thing Sheila had tried to eliminate had now become a community staple. As for Ridgewood Valley's new HOA president, the board had elected Roy Wheeler, a retired rancher who understood the value of the land. One of his first moves, officially banning any future HOA interference with agricultural properties. And Sheila Farrell? Last Amos had heard, she had moved to Florida, where she had joined another HOA, only this time she wasn't the boss. Amos couldn't imagine a worse punishment for her than having to live under the very kind of rules she once enforced. As the sun set over his unchanged, untamed 300 acres, Amos tipped his hat, took a deep breath of fresh farm air, and grinned. Some battles weren't just about winning. Some were about reminding people who was really in charge.